9 frameworks every brand builder needs. So a bit of background about me before we get into it. I'm the co-founder of Concept Bureau and Exposure Therapy. Concept Bureau is a brand strategy firm. We work with brands really trying to push the needle of culture. And Exposure Therapy is our private strategy community. We have a bunch of brand and strategy leaders around the world. Every month we do original research. In a couple of days I'm flying out to New York. We're doing a pajama party for strategists. So it's a good time. It's a lot of fun. And we're really trying to push our own thinking and everyone else's. And so we've been doing strategy for about 10 years. My background is in aerospace engineering, and I'm very much trying to come at strategy from a systems and processes approach. And you'll see a lot of that as we get into it. That, brand strategy, I think, is very much an art. There's a real art to creating something very meaningful for people. And the problem with art is it can sometimes you hit, sometimes you miss. So we really tried to make a strategy process, a framework and approach that systematizes that and gets you a much more consistent win rate in the work that you do. And I think what defines our approach is that we really look at this as changing the way that leaders see market and brand. That if you want to build an interesting strategy, you have to see the world in a way that others don't. And so that's really what we try and do and achieve in our strategy work, is to give really interesting and novel perspectives that allow you to create interesting and novel brands. So, before we get into these frameworks, I think the most important point around how to look at frameworks and how to look at this approach is that thinking really is leverage. I just saw a research report this morning about how people who think first and then use AI do much better in the task, but also neurologically, they actually get better at doing strategy over time. If you use AI and then think later, or you just use AI, your brain sort of atrophies. And so thinking is the leverage, it is the bottleneck, because the bottom line is that it doesn't matter how smart AI gets. We can reach AGI, but if you ask the wrong question, you will not get the right answer. And so this is the point here, is that you have to look at thinking as this is the work of doing strategy. And so what we've built here is a set of frameworks. And each of these are a very specific tool for a very specific problem. And the thing is that for a lot of strategists, frameworks are kind of like exercise equipment, right? You've probably got some in your closet that you haven't used in a very long time that, you should use, it's like, you feel guilty about it. The problem with frameworks is that people just don't use them, but they're so powerful for those who do. And so hopefully at least one of these you'll actually put into use. And I promise you'll find a lot of value, because these are all ones that we use actively every day in our practice. And so, yeah, each of these are designed to solve a specific problem. And the way that we've approached this, strategy is a huge thing. And especially in the age of AI, it's really about breaking problems down into their constituent components. And so, there are 3 important phases to strategy: exploration, decision, and action. And each of these need a completely different set of tools. They're a very different problem to solve. And so today we've got 9 frameworks, 3 in each of these phases. So you really have a robust set of tools that you can use to approach strategy. And this is what I mentioned at the very beginning, as a few of you joined. This is really what we're doing is metacognition. We're thinking about thinking and creating frameworks to really guide our process so that we're asking the right questions. So to get into it, the first topic is exploration. How do you get deeper insights? Every strategy is built on the foundation of strong insights. And one of our favorite frameworks, and the first one, is tight and loose culture. So Michelle Gelfand, who's a really interesting thinker, she's a sociologist, she has this framework that every culture exists on a spectrum. Some cultures are tight, they have strong social norms and a low tolerance for deviance, and some have weak social norms and are highly permissive. And everything exists on the spectrum. Every community, every nation, every market, every industry, every business. There's this really powerful spectrum. And what this spectrum defines is what the latent demand is in the market, in culture. So if you're in a tight market, people want looseness. And if you're in a loose market, people want tightness. And if you're building a brand, this is a really effective rubric to immediately look at the market and assess what is it that people want? What is their appetite right now for how you respond to them in culture? So it's a really effective way of finding a quick signal, because when things are tight, people want choice. They want alternate paths. They want new permissions. They want space for new norms. And you can really see this. If you look at education and healthcare, the amount of what some people consider woo-woo healthcare, right? The amount of different alternative ways of doing that. Even, the amount of new sort of homeschooling things that are popping up, that's really popular. That is in a direct response to how tight the culture is. There is an appetite for looseness. And so if you understand that, you can immediately identify that here's an opportunity. Here's a way that we can operate that is really valuable and is going to address that latent demand. And on the flip side of that, when a market is loose, people want tightness. So, AI is the loosest space there possibly could be. Everyone's clamoring for where is the clarity? How do we narrow our options? There's just so many ways to think and do. How do we find some guidance and how do we be less overwhelmed? One industry that you really see that clearly is parenting. There's so much chaos. And so now a lot of brands are boxing themselves into a very specific school of thought, right? They're introducing new ways of categorizing and narrowing the space. So here, this is how we do things. And so you can see as you do brand, you will find a really clear playbook immediately that will tell you what the appetite is. So that's our first framework. The second one is the shape of the market. This is the most basic rule of economics. And it's one of those things, again, talking about, like exercise equipment, this is the diet and exercise of strategy. It's the thing that is really powerful, but no one wants to do, right? This is such an important framework that once you understand it and once you actually use it, you'll get tons of leverage out of it. The point is that every market follows a very consistent shape. It starts off small and exponential returns, right? People don't know what this is. The playbook for brand is to surface the tension, provoke, and reframe the problem. People don't realize that there's a new way of doing things. Then as it matures, as people adopt, it turns to linear returns. This is where, most markets spend the majority of time. This is where you're really experimenting and testing. You're finding new ways to do things. Instead of introducing people to a new solution, you're now competing against others. So how do you be different, not better? Everyone's trying to compete on, we're the best at this, we're the best at that, and the consumers just don't care. It's like, show me why I should really care, right? And so it's a different playbook when you move from exponential to linear. And again, it's a different one when you move to depreciating returns. When the market gets really mature, suddenly everything is focused on optimization. You're building brand authority, you're carving out defensibility, you're optimizing your message. There's so much focus on optimization here. And so the point is that every market follows this track, but it's not just every market. You also find that, it's every benefit within a category. So for example, we just did some eco products, the eco benefit is on this curve somewhere, that's become much more depreciating returns recently. You've got, safe and clean and healthy for your family. That's also on this, maybe a little less depreciated than the eco benefit right now. Then you've got like in the beauty category, you can really see the dichotomy. In beauty, you see that a lot of businesses have spent so long selling high performance products that now it's deep depreciating returns. And so what you're seeing is beauty is really reorganizing everything around the experience. Now they're leaning really hard into fragrance, really hard into texture and the different sensory components. And Sephora is completely changing how they organize their shelving because they're moving from one feature to another in terms of this curve. So it's not just at the product level, it's not just at the industry level, it's at the actual benefit level you can see this. And the point is that this is a cycle. Every market, it's a straight line, but every cycle changes. And so when you understand that when one benefit gets commodified and moves into depreciating returns, the next one starts. And so when you really pay attention to the cycles, again, it tells you this is how we need to operate. When everyone's doing exploration, you move into linear. When everyone's moving linear, you move into depreciating, or you start a new cycle. And so this really, again, gives you a very clear playbook on how to operate differently. And the key point here is that the market is different here because the consumer is different at each of these phases. In the exponential phase, they don't know that there's a new solution, right? In the linear, they're comparing you against everyone else. And then the depreciating at the end of the curve, they've got really strong expectations of what they want. And so you can see that it's not markets that change, it's the consumers that are changing, that change the conditions of the market. So again, a really effective tool to say that at any phase of strategy, I can immediately look at tight and loose, and I can look at the shape of the market, and I already have a pretty good set of rules for how I should operate. And again, this really tells you as a brand, you can use this very effectively to make decisions. So the last exploration framework is the Rumsfeld matrix. Again, you're probably familiar with this. It's the four knowns, the known knowns to unknown unknowns, but it's really powerful if you actually use it. So the point here is that the best strategies operate from the most uncommon insights. And so your job as a strategy, and I always tell my team this, is we get paid to figure out what is the question that nobody in this industry has asked yet. That's the job. Most teams spend way too much time on known knowns, just confirming what everyone knows. Okay, boring. There's nothing strategically valuable there because if everyone knows it, it's useless. Every mid-industry report is doing the known unknowns. They're asking the questions that we all have, giving us answers that we could all probably find if we looked for it. There's very little value or novel strategic insight there. So again, if you're asking the questions that you already had before you started the project, it's probably not a huge ROI there. Where it gets interesting is the unknown known. So this is the domain of experience and intuition. So one of my favorite things to do is to find experts who have been in this space for an unreasonably long time and start trying to tease out things. This is where you don't realize you know something. There's the aha moment that the interviewee has as well as you as you're doing this. So, I always like tapping into academia. Sometimes you find some fascinating stuff. We did some beauty work recently. We were talking to an academic about fragrance, and there's so many interesting things that you won't find from the industry side. Also, sometimes just speaking to people who have been in the industry a very long time can reveal so many different perspectives that you wouldn't find. And so there's a lot of uncommon stuff here if you find the right people to talk to. And then lastly is the unknown unknowns. And this is the really important one. You have to find again, this is the question that no one else is asking. You have to search in places that no one else is looking. So I often think about this as a T-shaped knowledge graph. You want to go wider than everyone in terms of where you're looking, adjacent categories. And one of the reasons there is sometimes something is unknown in one industry, but it's actually really well known in another industry. And so you can actually find the information you're looking for if you go broader. Like sometimes I look at military operating manuals, and you'll find ways of thinking that just don't show up in business, but it's like, oh, that's really useful over here, right? So you want to go wider than everyone else, and then you want to find specifically where do you go deeper than everyone else. The main thing is you just have to get off the bell curve to find the really valuable stuff. So again, as you're approaching work, as you're approaching research, really think about the job is to find the unknown unknown. That will get you a strategy that no one else can copy because literally no one else has found it. So now we get to decision making. So exploration gives us a lot of insight into how to think about where the insights come from. Now it's how do you actually process those insights and think about coming to decisions. And one of my favorite ways to approach this is inversion. So I'm going to give you two of my all-time favorite business anecdotes: the Dallas airport and the bullet train. So Dallas airport had a huge problem. Everyone was complaining about baggage claim times. They were just waiting forever for their bags. Everyone was really frustrated. You might think the strategic problem there is how do we speed up the time that the bag takes to get to the baggage carousel? The solution that they found is to actually move the baggage claim further away from the gate so people had to walk longer so they weren't waiting longer. They completely reframed what the problem was, and they solved it, right? And so you could spend an incredible amount of time making things more efficient, or you can invert the problem and ask a different question. My even more favorite one is the bullet train. So the problem with the bullet train is, every now and again they have to clean the train. It takes 8 minutes, and the worst part is it's sat at the station. So you're literally sat there waiting for the train. It's right there, but the doors are locked, and everyone's really frustrated. Again, you might think there's how do we clean the train faster? The solution, and this is fantastic, is they made the cleaning crew they had uniforms that made them look invisible. You couldn't see them because they were the same color as the seats. They gave them highly visible uniforms. That's all they did. And what's incredible about this is suddenly people understood why they were waiting, right? They could see the people cleaning. And what's even better than that is they actually started keeping the trains cleaner because now they had an understanding of what was happening. So again, they inverted the problem. And so the job of strategy is to figure out what's the right question, not what's the right answer. And in all of our education, the one thing you can never ask is this the right question, right? You just have to find the answer. You're trained to find the answer. And the strategy is figuring out, is this the right question? So there's a couple of examples here about how to think about those reframes, but this is just a really valuable one that stop. And before you try and answer, is this even the right question? Another really important one. Again, a lot of these you might have heard of, but there's a way of using these that's really valuable. So our brain has two very distinct modes of ideation: divergent thinking and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is your shower thoughts, it's your improv, it's play, right? You're doing something very creative. It's very unstructured. There are very little rules. Convergent thinking is chess, it's poker, it's editing a movie. There's a very specific set of rules. There's a success criteria. You're narrowing things down. You literally have different neurological circuits for each of these things. So the process is very different. With divergent thinking, it's the yes and, it's synthesizing things. It's focusing on the bigger picture outcome, right? Whereas convergent is iterating, it's defining success criteria, it's stack ranking different criteria. So here's the way to use this is that convergent thinking absolutely kills divergent thinking. The worst thing you can do in an improv session is say no but, right? It's always yes and. And convergent thinking, just because it uses a different circuit, it shuts down creativity immediately. So the thing that you have to do is build a wall between these two practices. When you're brainstorming with a team or by yourself, you have to completely treat these as entirely separate exercises. So literally, change the room, change the doc, change the meeting, take a break, create different groups, whatever you can do to create a line between these. One of my favorite practices, Priya Parker from the book The Art of Gathering, she'll literally light a candle in a boardroom to interrupt people's expectations of what's going on here, right? So however you can do it to just interrupt the pattern and separate these, because you can do incredible divergent thinking, and then take a beat and then do the convergent thinking. You've got such an incredible bunch of ideas to work with. And so keeping these separate is so important in your creative process. And then lastly on decision making is all around attention. The market is defined by attention. That's the job. The job of strategy, especially brand, is really creating tension. Every iconic brand is understood through the lens of tension. You understand that there's a tension that works and everyone's competing for salience. So tension is everything when it comes to brand. And so you need to understand, as for your brand that you're building, what is the tension that you're using? And the thing about tension is that our appetites and expectations change. In 2015, we had peak moral tension. This is Tom's, Everlane, Patagonia, American Apparel, Vice, right? There was this contradiction, and then you sell the resolution, right? You surface the moral, the moral conflict. You sell the resolution. You're competing, sort of, capitalism versus humanity, idealism versus reality. And then, a couple of years ago, we had sort of peak aesthetic tension. So all that nostalgia core, all the chaos packaging, Be Real, Balenciaga is a perfect case of this. You're interrupting expectations and you're signaling an in-group status, right? You're creating a whole symbolism, semiotics around your product. But now we're kind of moving into a new phase of tension, which is much more existential, right? With everything going on in the world. This is different, This is like A24 films. This is Brian Johnson. There's a whole wave of Christianity in Silicon Valley, astrology. A lot of this is existential questions. It's chaos versus coherence, agency versus surrender, spirituality versus rationality. You're acknowledging the chaos and you're creating space for people to navigate it. You're reflecting something back. And one of the things that went viral earlier this year was this whole trend of vegan but bacon, right? That if you want to be vegan but you don't want to give up bacon, then don't, be vegan but also eat bacon. It went super viral, but it shows you this kind of contradiction, this contrast that you can play in. And again, brands that succeed really know how to leverage tension. So it's a really important tool as you do decision making, is how do you optimize that? So lastly is actions. How do you actually make strategic actions and turn all those decisions into effective impact? So one of my favorite tools here is friction versus fuel. We have a really deep bias to solve problems by adding things. It feels really good when we did this and we solved the problem, but most of the time the solution is removing friction. So there's a great case of this. There was a furniture company and they had huge cart abandonment. People would love their furniture, put it in the cart, and then they would abandon. And so they started talking to people why. And it turns out they just didn't know what to do with their old furniture. They couldn't get rid of it. And so that was a huge friction. And so you could add an infinite amount of motivation, but if you can't get rid of that old sofa, nothing's going to happen. And so they started a program where they'll take your old furniture when you buy the new stuff. Huge, huge, huge spike in sales, right? And so as you think about solving problems, it really satisfies the ego to add fuel, but you have to look at the friction because that's usually where the opportunity is. So last two here, the J curve. Every strategic project goes through the J curve, right? Is that to make change, it initially comes at a cost and then you get a higher ROI. And the question is, how do you weather that gap? Because a lot of the time, the amount of brands and incredible projects that get killed because they can't get through that dip, it's incredible. There's so many brands that can't do that. And the reason why is because until you get to the other side of that ROI, you're running on conviction. You're not running on data. There is no data that can tell you this is going to work. You're running on the conviction of your strategy. And so as you do strategy, conviction management is your job. Your job with insights and building that perspective is to build up enough conviction to get you to the other side of that. And that's such an important part in strategy, is that chief commodity isn't insight, it is conviction. That's what gets you to the other side. And that's what's really important. And the thing is, if you get to the other side, you have so much information because you actually took action. But every business that goes halfway and then is this isn't working and they move back, the strategy fails. And so this is a really important way of safeguarding your strategy. It's you have to build enough conviction to get the leadership to the other side. So lastly is one of my favorite tools, the pre-mortem. So the one question that you're not really allowed to ask in a strategy project is, what if we fail, right? It's you look like the bad guy. It's a horrible thing. No one wants to talk about this, but this is such an important question because one of the biggest unknown knowns is that everyone has really good intuitions as to why projects fail. If you've had a career at all, you've been on a project that probably hasn't succeeded, and there's a very good chance that most of you knew why it would fail and it failed anyway and no one did anything. And so all you need to do is just create space. So it's a very simple process. Just do a thought experiment with a team. Imagine 1 year from now, the project failed. And then ask yourself, why did it fail? Make a list, stack rank that list, and then come up with a reason to mitigate, a way to mitigate each of those reasons why it might fail. It's an incredibly simple thing, but if you franchise it as a pre-mortem exercise, then you're not the villain, and it lets you surface those unknown knowns. Like we all know why it's going to fail, and literally 1 hour can save a whole project just by mitigating a lot of these things. It's a really effective tool at safeguarding things. So hopefully across all these frameworks, you can see how we've tried to be very rigorous. You've got a whole toolkit for doing exploration, thinking about decision making, thinking about how do you come to effective actions. These are tools that we use all the time in our practice. And I just want to take a minute before we get to Q&A to talk about our Brand Strategy Masterclass. This lightning lesson is just a sort of teaser and taste of what we've built. So this is a 3-week process. And we've built something that we've tried to create a whole framework that goes end to end, all the way from insight to positioning to identity, so that at any single phase of the strategy process, from literally, I don't know where to start, to here is the entire strategy, we have a set of tools for all of that. And I can't tell you the amount of times we've done strategy work and we start the project and I'm like, I have no idea where this is going. I have no idea what this is going to look like. And then eventually we get a slam dunk, and you just have to trust the process. And this is the process. We've packaged, this is what we've been refining for the last 10 years at Concept Bureau. And we work with a lot of brands that you're probably familiar with in refining that process.